Do you feel that after you enter adulthood, your level of happiness slowly starts to decline? And that it becomes even more obvious when you reach your late 30s or your 40s. This is not a coincidence because there are many studies showing that happiness or life satisfaction across different age groups follows a U-shaped curve. Happiness tends to decline through adulthood, reaches a low point in the late 40s, and then gradually increases again later in life. In this video, I want to talk about this curve, why it exists, whether it's still relevant today, and how we can use mathematical concepts to explain and counter this trend. Researchers suggest that during our education years, when we are still in school, we tend to feel happier. For many people, this is one of the happiest periods of life. Personally, I agree. Before my 20s, when I was still studying, life was simple with very few commitments beyond academics. We could spend whole afternoons with friends in town or playing soccer in school without thinking about productivity, progress, or what came next. Then, when we start working, earning our first income independently without relying on our parents for allowance anymore, that also feels good. But as we move into our 30s, things begin to change. People may enter a stable relationship, buy a home, get married, start a family, and basically having more commitments. These are meaningful milestones, but they come with responsibility, pressure, and stress. By the time we reach our 40s, commitment usually reaches its highest point. Children are growing up with new challenges here and there. Parents are aging with increasing medical expenses. At work, your career may be at its peak, but may also be stagnating. You may feel pressure from younger colleagues. All of these resulted in stress and caused the decline in happiness level, which explain the dip in the happiness curve. Now, here's a part of this curve that may confuse people. We generally agree that health is strongly linked to happiness. Then why do elderly people report higher levels of happiness even though their health is objectively worse? This doesn't seem to make sense, but I do have an explanation for that. I think it has more to do with our relationship with health at different stages in life. In our 30s and 40s, this is often the first time we notice clear signs of health deterioration. For example, our energy level and fitness may start to decline, we get tired more easily, aches appear in different parts of the body, eyesight worsen, and small health issues start to show up. Recently, I started playing badminton at a local club in Japan. After my very first session, it took my body almost 3 days to recover from the muscle soreness. After that, I became much more intentional, making sure I warm up properly, stretch well, and have some protein drinks during and after the session. These are things we didn't really think about when we were young, but we do now. By the time we reach older age, health may be poorer, but expectations have already adjusted. People adapt their routines, they become more selective with activities, they accept certain limitations as normal, such as having medication, dietary restrictions. So elderly people are not happy because their health is better, but because their health issues are no longer a sudden shock. Researchers also note that elderlies tend to feel more content with life at this stage. They are less driven by competition and comparison and are more focused on the positive aspect of their lives. Now, here's where things get more concerning. Recent studies suggest the U-shaped curve may be flattening or shifting. That's not a good sign. A flattened curve means that younger generations are starting off less happy than previous ones. This shouldn't come as a surprise as well because we see that mental health issues among young people are rising, largely driven by social media induced anxiety and fewer real world connection as more interactions move online. And we still don't know how AI will affect this direction. I also suspect that the bottom of the curve is going to move towards the right. Instead of bouncing back in the late 40s, happiness may only start to recover in the 50s or beyond. This is driven by a few structural changes. Retirement is happening later, people are starting families later, and life expectancy is also rising. This will naturally lead to a longer working lives, with financial pressure and responsibilities stretching over more years. Another factor that I personally think may have an impact on older age happiness level is the rising number of people who remain single or do not have children. A lack of companionship later in life may contribute to lower level of happiness. That said, companionship and kinship only add to happiness when the relationships are positive and healthy, which is not always the case. But when they are, companionship and family connections can be a major source of happiness later in life. If we take a look at the income level across different age groups in Singapore, which I believe should be applicable to most developed countries, it seems to follow an N-shaped curve. As you can see, income usually increases into midlife, and yet happiness does not increase at the same rate, and it even decreases if we refer to the U-shaped curve mentioned earlier. This again does not seem to make sense. The reason behind this is because of the diminishing returns. When income increases, its impact on quality of life is not linear. In our early adulthood, the transition from lower income levels to mid-income levels, every additional dollar makes a significant difference to the quality of life. You will move from meeting basic survival needs to having safety, stability, and choice. The basic needs are getting satisfied comfortably, and hence the increase in quality of life and happiness is the most significant here. However, the emotional value of additional income starts to decline beyond that. Beyond that point, further income growth mainly improves comfort incrementally rather than transformative. The marginal return diminishes. At the same time, the expectations of the higher income continue to rise, and maybe even faster than the income itself. I think housing is a good illustration of diminishing returns. For many Singaporeans, the move from living with parents to owning a modest home or HDB represents a major improvement in quality of life. However, further upgrades such as moving into condo or private housing or larger units or more prestigious locations tend to improve comfort incrementally rather than fundamentally. At the same time, housing upgrades usually involve higher mortgages, increased maintenance, and greater financial pressure, which can offset much of the perceived benefit. Knowing all this, the shifting happiness curve, the decline in health, and the diminishing returns of income, is this all doom and gloom for people, especially the millennials in their 30s and 40s? Not necessary. In fact, this may be an opportunity to think differently and move against the trend. I like to use a mathematical way of thinking to approach the happiness curve. First, instead of using level of satisfaction, which is often used as a proxy for happiness as the y-axis, let's replace the vertical axis with quality of life, which is more objective. We can assume that for most people, especially millennials, quality of life roughly follows an N-shaped curve. Most of us start with a lower quality of life, assuming we are not born with a silver spoon. We come from relatively humble beginnings, work our way up, and gradually increase our income and net worth. At some point, we reach a peak, maybe in our mid-40s. But based on what we discussed earlier, quality of life may start to dip, primarily due to health issues, career stagnation, and rising stress level. Now, here's the key idea. Happiness is derived from this quality of life curve, but it is not a direct one-to-one relationship. If happiness were equal to quality of life, we would have been miserable when we were young and broke, and unhappy again after retirement. Clearly, that's not how it works. Happiness should be thought of as both the derivative and the integral of the quality of life curve. Okay, don't worry if you're not familiar with mathematical terms, let me explain. The derivative simply refers to the gradient of the curve or the rate of change. In other words, how your quality of life is moving over time matters more than the level itself. When we were young and broke, we were improving. Income increased steadily, we learned new things, we accumulated new skills, life got better year by year. The direction was positive. That's why those years will feel hopeful and energizing. This is why Jack Ma once said that one of the happiest periods of his life was when he worked as an English teacher, earning around $12 a month. At first, we may think that he was talking nonsense, but when viewed through his lens, he may be telling the truth. What made that period meaningful was the fact that his life was clearly moving forward. So now the question becomes, how do we stay happy later in life when quality of life may start to dip? First, we need to understand that contentment is not a privilege reserved for old age. We can feel content at any stage of life if we reduce unnecessary comparison and cut off toxic relationships. Stepping off the race early, walking your own path, and creating your own system can help quality of life remain high for much longer. Health also becomes even more critical at this stage as it has one of the strongest direct relationships with quality of life. This means that diet, exercise, and lifestyle choices are no longer optional, they become priorities. Taking care of your health earlier helps prevent sharp declines in quality of life later on. So, to sum up the derivative part, as long as you are improving and learning, direction matters more than position, even if your current situation is not the most ideal. Now, let's talk about integral, which is somewhat counterintuitive since integral is the inverse of derivative. The integral represents accumulation. It is the sum of high quality living, meaningful experiences, and moments of joy over your entire lifetime. In simple terms, it is the area under the curve from birth to life expectancy, let's say around 80 years. A good life is not defined by a great ending, but by the accumulation of the entire journey. If you agree with this idea, it becomes harder to justify sacrificing most of your adult life just to optimize the last 15 or 20 years, knowing that the odds such as poorer health are against you. Throughout our life, we often say things like, hey, wait until I grow up, wait until I get married, wait until I retire. But we need to recognize something important. Some experiences can only be enjoyed during a certain stage in life. And often the best time is earlier, not later. This idea is also discussed in a book that is very popular, Die with Zero. Planning for the future is important, but living in the present matters just as much. Finally, if happiness is shaped by direction and accumulation, not just the peak outcomes, then the way we structure our next generation early years matters more than we think. Childhood is not preparation for adulthood, it's already part of life. When early years are shaped with balance, curiosity, and space to growth, I believe they will be better equipped to shape their own happiness curve later on. Anyway, that's a topic for another video. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.